It was the kind of silence that gets under your skin, the kind you only find on the vast Kansas prairie when something's gone terribly wrong. For Eleanor Sullivan, that silence was a scream. She stood on the porch of the farmhouse her husband Michael had built with his own two hands, but it wasn't theirs anymore. Not since the day the banker, Jacob Winters, had put a bullet in Michael's chest and the town had called it self-defense. Her hands rested on her belly, 7 months pregnant, where their third child kicked and squirmed, already fighting a world that had dealt them a losing hand. "Mama?" 8-year-old Sarah's voice was a whisper beside her. "Are they coming now?" Eleanor looked down at her daughter, a girl with old eyes clutching a journal like it was the only thing left holding their world together. Since Michael's death, Sarah had stopped telling stories. She just wrote them down, trying to trap the memories before they could fade. "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice a stranger in her own ears. "But we have everything that matters. Will the new place have a porch?" The question was a knife in Eleanor's heart. She didn't know if the new place would have walls, let alone a porch. "I don't know, baby, but we'll have each other." Her 5-year-old son, William, sat on a packed trunk nearby. He hadn't spoken a single word in the 3 months since he'd watched his father die. His world had shrunk to the size of a charcoal stub and the small scraps of paper he carried everywhere. He just drew over and over the same disturbing image. Eleanor knelt beside him. "What's that, love?" He turned the paper toward her. It was a man, a tall, bearded man, standing in the middle of a fire, a church burning down behind him. It was the 5th time he'd drawn it that week. A chill snaked up her spine, cold and sharp against the August heat. William had never seen a man like that. He'd never seen a church fire. So where were these images coming from? The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from the nightmare of her son's imagination. It was Pastor Holbrook, the town's spiritual leader, his face arranged in a mask of sympathy that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was the one who had assured everyone that Jacob Winters, the banker, was a good man. A man who wouldn't shoot an unarmed farmer over a late mortgage payment. Of course, he'd failed to mention that Jacob Winters was his wife's cousin. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, dismounting. "Mr. Winters was very clear. The property must be vacant by sundown." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "We're ready." "Good," the pastor said, a little too quickly. "I've arranged for you to take the eastbound wagon. Your brother in Ohio will surely—" "We're going west," Eleanor cut in. The surprise on his face was a small, bitter victory. "I won't be a burden to anyone." He frowned, his piety slipping. "West? A woman in your condition? With 2 small children? It's improper. It's foolish." "Improper?" The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Was it improper for a banker to shoot my husband in his own home? Was it foolish for Michael to believe a man of God would stand for justice? The pastor's face hardened into stone. "Michael made his choices. The Lord asks us to accept his will." "The Lord asks for justice," Eleanor shot back, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "And since we found none here, we'll seek it elsewhere." William had stopped drawing. His dark, silent eyes flicked from his mother to the pastor, a tiny judge weighing their souls. Pastor Holbrook let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Very well, but don't come asking for charity from this town when the wilderness chews you up and spits you out." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving them in a cloud of dust and righteousness. Eleanor looked at her children, at the meager pile of their belongings, at the $23 in her pocket that had to last them. How long? Forever, maybe. Going west was a desperate gamble, but staying here under the thumb of the men who had destroyed her family wasn't an option. It was a slow death, and Eleanor Sullivan was done with dying. She looked back at the house one last time, at the spot on the floorboards where Michael's blood had soaked into the wood. "I'll make it right," she whispered to his ghost. "Somehow, I'll make it right." 3 weeks later, their money was almost gone, and they were stranded in a Montana town that was little more than a smudge on the vast, empty landscape. A general store, a saloon, and a church with no bell. The wind had teeth here, biting through Eleanor's thin shawl with the promise of a brutal winter. Her back was a knot of constant pain, and the baby felt heavier with every step. They had nothing. They were nothing. Just another broken family washed up on the shores of the frontier. As they stumbled toward the saloon, a piece of paper nailed to a post caught her eye. It was newer than the faded advertisements around it, the ink still dark and sharp. Eleanor leaned closer, her eyes scanning the words that would change everything. Union veteran seeks lawful employment through winter. $1 contract, no questions about past. Experienced in hunting, building, and basic medicine. Swears to protect women and children with his life. That last line hit her like a physical blow. Swears to protect women and children with his life. In her world, protection was a weapon used against the weak, not a shield for them. $1. They had just enough. It was a risk, a terrible risk, trusting a complete stranger. But starvation was not a risk. It was a certainty. She took her children's cold hands and pushed open the saloon door. The place was dim, smelling of whiskey and regret. A few men looked up, their eyes lingering on her swollen belly. Their expressions a mix of pity and predatory interest. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the barkeep. "I'm looking for the man who posted the notice," she said, her voice shaking only a little. The barkeep grunted, jerking his thumb toward a dark corner. "Reed, he's over there. Been waiting 3 days. Figured he was about to give up." Eleanor turned, and her blood ran cold. Sitting alone, his back to the wall, was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a dark beard streaked with gray. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were the color of gunmetal, sharp and assessing. He wasn't looking at her like a victim. He was looking at her like he saw the steel spine holding her together. And then she felt a frantic tugging on her dress. It was William. He was shaking, his eyes wide, pointing from the man in the corner to his drawing pad. With trembling fingers, he was sketching. It was the same man, the man from his nightmares, the man standing in the fire. The stranger, Reed, stood up as they approached. He was even taller than she'd thought, a mountain of a man who moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. He inclined his head. "Ma'am." His voice was a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. "Mr. Reed," Eleanor managed, her mind spinning. "I'm Eleanor Sullivan. These are my children." She took a deep breath. "I'd like to hire you." Reed's gaze flicked to the children, lingering for a moment on William and his drawing. Then his eyes met hers again. "I have a cabin, north of here. It's sturdy. Good hunting." He looked at her belly. "Winter comes hard and fast up here. It won't be easy." "I'm stronger than I look," Eleanor said. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt it, Mrs. Sullivan." She pulled out their last $1, the coin warm from her nervous hand. "Consider yourself hired." He took the coin, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. "We leave in an hour. There's a storm coming." As Reed gathered their few things, Sarah whispered, "Can we trust him, Mama?" Eleanor watched him move through the saloon, a bulwark of quiet competence in a room full of noise and chaos. "I think so," she said, more to convince herself than her daughter. But then William tugged on her sleeve. He showed her a new drawing. It was the bearded man, Reed, standing in front of their small family. His arms were outstretched, as if shielding them from something just outside the frame. Either her son could see the future, or something much, much stranger was happening. The journey north was a silent battle against the cold. Snow began to fall, thick and heavy, muffling the world in a blanket of white. Just as dusk began to settle, they crested a ridge, and Eleanor saw it. A small cabin nestled in a valley, smoke curling from its chimney like a welcome. "You left a fire going?" she asked, surprised. Reed shook his head. "A neighbor, Martha Blackwood. She keeps an eye on the place." The thought of another person, another woman, nearby was a small comfort. The inside of the cabin was simple, clean, and blessedly warm. Reed gestured to a curtained-off sleeping area. "You and the children take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." He prepared a simple stew, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hardship and survival. They ate in silence, the children too exhausted to speak. As Eleanor tucked them into the bed, she saw Reed by the window, staring out into the storm. He was holding a worn photograph, which he quickly hid when he sensed her watching. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice low, I need to be clear about something. I'm not just a man looking for work. He turned, and the look in his eyes was heavy, haunted. I owe a debt. Protecting you is how I'm repaying it. A debt? Eleanor asked. To whom? His gaze was direct, unflinching. To a man who can no longer collect it himself. Before she could ask more, a sharp crack split the night air. A gunshot, clear and close even through the falling snow. In an instant, Reed transformed. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness, and grabbed a rifle from the wall in one fluid motion. The gentle stranger was gone. In his place was a soldier, a killer. Get down, he commanded, his voice a blade of cold steel, and keep the children quiet. Eleanor scrambled to the floor, pulling her terrified children close. Reed moved to the window, a silent shadow against the storm. They waited, frozen in the dark, every muscle screaming with tension. The only sound was the howling wind and the frantic beating of Eleanor's own heart. Finally, Reed lowered the rifle, just slightly. Hunters, probably, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't believe it, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the gunshot was not for a deer. It was a message, and it was meant for them. That night, Eleanor dreamed of fire, not the warm, comforting fire of the hearth, but a roaring inferno that ate wood and stone, the screams of the trapped lost in its roar. She was younger, trapped in a burning building, smoke filling her lungs, her vision blurring. And then a figure emerged from the flames, a tall, bearded man, his face grim but his hands steady as he reached for her. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was silent, save for the soft breathing of her children. Across the room, Reed sat in a chair by the dying embers, his rifle across his lap. He wasn't asleep. He was watching, waiting. The dream felt too real, a memory almost. But it wasn't hers. She had no memory of a fire, of being saved. And yet, as she lay there listening to the wind howl, a strange feeling settled over her. That dream, William's drawings, Reed's mysterious debt. They were all threads of the same story, a story she was now a part of, whether she wanted to be or not. The first hint of dawn crept into the cabin, and Eleanor saw the scars on Reed's hands. Old burns, a puckered hole through his left palm that could only have been a bullet. This was a man made of old wounds, held together by sheer will. He moved with a quiet purpose, stoking the fire, making coffee, careful not to wake them. It was a small act of consideration, but in Eleanor's world, small kindnesses were rarer than gold. When he saw she was awake, he simply said, "Coffee's ready, and oatmeal." As they ate the simple meal, Sarah, ever the journalist, asked Reed her first direct question. "Is it safe to go outside?" He looked at her with a seriousness he would afford an adult. "Yes, but stay inside of the cabin. The snow can turn a man around in a heartbeat." He turned to Eleanor. "I need to check my trap lines. Split more wood." "We'll help," she offered immediately. His eyes flickered to her belly, but he simply nodded. "The boy can come with me, if he's willing." To Eleanor's shock, William, who hadn't willingly left her side in months, looked at Reed and gave a small, deliberate nod. As the two of them disappeared into the woods, Sarah said, "He's different from Papa, but not in a bad way." "No," Eleanor agreed, "not in a bad way." "William likes him," Sarah added, as if that settled the matter, and perhaps it did. An hour later, they returned. William was carrying 2 snowshoe hares, his face glowing with a pride Eleanor hadn't seen since before Michael's death. He was still silent, but the light was back in his eyes. "Good helper," Reed said, with a hint of warmth in his voice. "Got a sharp eye for tracks." The words were a balm on Eleanor's raw heart. This man, this stranger, had given her son a piece of himself back in just a few hours. Late that afternoon, as Reed's axe split logs with powerful rhythmic swings, a figure on a pony emerged from the trees. It was an old woman, her back ramrod straight, her dark eyes missing nothing. Her black hair, streaked with silver, was woven into a crown around her head. "Martha," Reed said with a nod of respect. "Nathaniel," she replied, her voice strong. "I see you've brought guests to your sanctuary." Sanctuary. The word seemed to fit. This wasn't just a cabin, it was a refuge. Reed introduced them, and Martha's piercing gaze took in Eleanor, her children, and her swollen belly. "The child is strong," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She turned to Reed, her expression growing serious. "I've brought herbs and news." Reed's body went still. "What news?" "3 men in town, asking questions." Martha's eyes met Eleanor's. "Asking about a woman, a widow traveling with 2 children. One of them claims to be her brother-in-law." The world tilted. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. "Ezekiel," she whispered. "Jacob Winter's older brother. A man colder and more ruthless than the banker who had pulled the trigger. A man who had always looked at her with a chilling, possessive hunger." Reed's jaw was a line of granite. "When did they arrive?" "Yesterday," Martha said. "They told the barkeep they were heading north. Today. North. Toward them. They hadn't escaped. They had just led the wolves to a new den. And they weren't just a danger to themselves anymore. They were a danger to Reed, to Martha. The fragile sense of safety she'd started to feel shattered into a million pieces. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. That evening, after the children were asleep, Reed and Eleanor sat by the fire. The air was thick with unspoken questions. "Tell me about Ezekiel Winters," Reed said, his voice a low rumble. "He's cruel," Eleanor began, struggling for the words. "He helped Jacob cover up what happened to Michael. He runs the family, their bank, everything. I don't understand why he would follow us all the way here. We have nothing left for them to take." "Men like that don't need a reason," Reed said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Sometimes it's just about finishing the job, about not leaving any loose ends." He spoke with the chilling certainty of a man who had met his share of monsters. Eleanor looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the soldier beneath the homesteader's clothes. "What should we do?" "For now we wait. We prepare," he said. His eyes met hers, steady and reassuring. "And if they find us, they'll learn that I keep my promises, Mrs. Sullivan." Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor found him by the window again, his rifle across his lap. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow. "Why did William draw you before we met?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her. "How could he possibly know what you look like?" Reed turned from the window, his face half in shadow. "Some people see things, Eleanor, especially children who have seen too much." He paused. "I've seen stranger things myself." "The debt you owe," she pressed, needing to understand. "Who was it to?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the worn photograph. He handed it to her. In the flickering firelight, she saw 2 young soldiers in Union blue, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a younger Reed, his eyes the same, though his face was less weathered. The other man made her heart stop. "Michael," she breathed, her fingers tracing the ghost of her husband's smile. "He saved my life at Gettysburg." Reed's voice was rough with emotion. "Took a bullet that was meant for me. I've been carrying that debt for a long time." Understanding crashed over her. You knew who I was. That notice in the saloon was for you," he confirmed. "Michael wrote to me a few months ago. He was worried about Winters. He asked me, if anything happened, to find his family, to make sure you were safe. By the time I got the letter..." He didn't need to finish. She sank into a chair, her mind reeling. This wasn't chance. It wasn't luck. It was a promise, reaching out from beyond the grave. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "Would you have trusted me?" he asked quietly. "A stranger showing up on your doorstep, claiming to be your dead husband's army buddy? Or would you have thought I was just another man trying to take advantage of a widow?" He was right. She wouldn't have trusted him. "William knew," she whispered. "He drew you standing in fire." Reed's expression was unreadable. Maybe he was seeing a memory, one that isn't his." "What are you talking about?" "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes the mind buries things. Trauma's too terrible to remember. It builds a wall to protect itself." "A memory of what?" she demanded. He looked at her. his gray eyes full of a sorrow that seemed ancient. A fire, a long time ago, a chapel in a town called Ellensburg. The name meant nothing to her, and yet, deep in the locked rooms of her mind, a door creaked open. She could almost smell smoke. She could almost feel the heat. "I don't understand," she said, a new kind of fear creeping in. "The man William has been drawing," Reed said, his voice barely a whisper. "He isn't just me, Eleanor." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the silent cabin. "He's drawing us." Eleanor stared at him, the world narrowing to the space between them, the crackling fire, and the impossible words hanging in the air. "Us?" "10 years ago," Reed began, his voice low and steady, as if recounting a piece of history that belonged to someone else. "I was working as a Pinkerton agent, investigating a string of fires, all on properties the Winters family wanted to acquire." Pinkerton. The name hit her like a stone. They were detectives, enforcers, sometimes little more than hired guns. It was another layer to this man she couldn't reconcile. "My investigation led me to Ellensburg," he continued, "to a chapel that was being used as a boarding house for young women. I got there too late. The fire was already out of control, but I could hear someone screaming inside." The smell of smoke in her dreams grew stronger, acrid, terrifying. "It was you, Eleanor," he said softly. "You were 17, locked in a back room." A flash of memory, sharp and blinding. A locked door, a man's face twisted with rage. Ezekiel Winters, younger, but the eyes were the same. Cold, possessive. "Ezekiel," she whispered, the name tasting like poison. Reed nodded grimly. "He'd become obsessed with you, his distant cousin. When you refused him, he set the fire. If he couldn't have you, no one would." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. It wasn't a dream, it was real. The heat, the smoke, the terror. It was all hers, buried alive in her own mind. "I pulled you out just before the roof collapsed," Reed said. "You were unconscious, traumatized. The doctor said the shock was so great, your mind might never recover." He suggested a new technique, a way to help soldiers forget the horrors of battle, to wall off the memory. "You made me forget," she said, the accusation hanging between them. "You asked me to," he corrected gently. "You were barely lucid, but you begged me. You said you couldn't live with it, so I helped you forget. I gave you a new name, Sullivan, my mother's maiden name, and arranged for a family heading west to take you in. I never thought, I never imagined you'd meet a man named Michael Sullivan and fall in love." The coincidences were staggering, fates intertwined in ways she couldn't comprehend. And her son, her silent, watchful son. "William sees it," she breathed. "He sees the memory you took away." "It would seem so," Reed said. Suddenly, a small voice cut through the heavy silence. "You saved Mama." They both turned. William stood in the doorway to the sleeping area, his small face pale in the firelight, his eyes ancient. It was the first time he had spoken in 3 months. The words were rusty, fragile, but they were real. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she rushed to him, pulling him into an embrace that was more for her own comfort than his. He had spoken. The spell was broken. When she looked up, Reed was watching them, and the look on his face was one of profound, soul-deep pain. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes," she agreed, her voice thick with tears. "You should have." Just then, a sound from outside sent them all scrambling. A low creak of wood, then a soft thud against the cabin wall. Reed was at the window in an instant, rifle in hand. He peered through a crack in the shutters into the moonlit snow. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered, holding William tight. Reed was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, his face a mask of disbelief. "I don't know," he said. "I don't see anyone. But something's out there." He pointed to the floor by the door. "Something was left for us." Lying just inside the doorway, as if pushed under the gap, was a small leather-bound book. A journal. It was old, the cover cracked and weathered. Reed approached it cautiously, nudging it with the barrel of his rifle before picking it up. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, feminine. The date was from years ago. It's Rebecca's journal, he murmured, a strange recognition in his eyes. Who's Rebecca? Eleanor asked. A woman I helped, he said, his eyes scanning the pages. A war widow. She and her daughter stayed in this cabin one winter before moving on. But this should be with her in Oregon. How did it get here? Sarah, woken by the commotion, peered out from the sleeping area. Maybe she's a ghost, she whispered, her eyes wide. No ghost, Reed said, though he didn't sound convinced. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more troubled. He stopped at the final entry. Listen to this, he said, and began to read aloud. I leave this place restored. Nathaniel Reed gave us shelter and asked for nothing in return. But there is a secret to this valley, a darkness. He believes the threat is from the outside world, but I fear it is already here. There is another cabin, hidden deep in the woods, a place where the trees grow too close together. I saw men there once, men with cold eyes. I told Nathaniel, but he found no sign of it. I pray he is right, but I fear he is not. A hidden cabin, men with cold eyes. It could only mean one thing. They're not in town, Eleanor said, the realization dawning on her with terrifying clarity. They're already here. They've been watching us this whole time. The sanctuary had been a cage all along, and the door was about to slam shut. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. They weren't just isolated, they were being observed, hunted. Every move they made, every conversation they had inside these thin wooden walls might have been overheard. The sense of violation was sickening. We have to get out of here, Eleanor said, her voice tight with panic. No, Reed said, his own voice dangerously calm. Running is what they expect. It's what they want. It would put us out in the open, on their terms. He paced the small room, his mind working, a strategist assessing the battlefield. This cabin is defensible. We have food, water, and a clear view of the clearing. This is where we make our stand. We? Eleanor looked at him. Nathaniel, this isn't your fight. You fulfilled your promise to Michael. You got us to safety. You can't die for us. He stopped pacing and turned to her. For the first time, she saw fire in his gunmetal eyes, a heat that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. This stopped being about a promise the moment Ezekiel Winters decided to come after you, he said, and it stopped being about Michael's death the moment I learned I failed you 10 years ago in Ellensburg. I didn't just save you from a fire, Eleanor. I erased a part of your life. I sent you out into the world alone and wounded. This is my fight now. It always was. Before she could process the weight of his words, Sarah spoke from the doorway. The book, she said, pointing to Rebecca's journal. In my dream last night, the lady from the book was pointing down. Reed and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Down where, Sarah? Reed asked gently. Just down, she said. Under the floor. Reed's eyes narrowed. He crossed to the rough-hewn floorboards in the center of the room. He ran his hand over them, then stopped. One of the boards was slightly looser than the others. Using the tip of his knife, he pried it up. Beneath it was a hollow space, and inside that space was a small metal strongbox, rusted with age. This isn't mine, Reed said, pulling it out. I've lived here for years. I've never seen this before. The box wasn't locked. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a stack of yellowed papers tied with a faded ribbon. And on top of the stack was an envelope. On it, in a familiar, steady hand, was a single name. Eleanor. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Michael's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she took the envelope and broke the seal. The letter inside was dated just a week before his death. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and Jacob Winters has made good on his threats. But know this, my death was not just about a late mortgage payment. I stumbled onto something much bigger. For months, I have been gathering evidence of the Winters brothers' crimes, land fraud, bribery, extortion. The documents in this box prove it all. I believe they even murdered a federal land agent who was getting too close. I knew they were watching me. I had to hide this evidence in the one place they would never think to look. On a business trip to Montana last year, I met a man, a war veteran named Reed, who told me of his secluded cabin. I came here myself in secret and hid this box, praying you would never need it. I have also enclosed a letter for Reed, explaining everything. This evidence is your weapon, Eleanor. Your only protection. Use it to secure justice for me and a future for our children. Do not trust the local law in Kansas. The Winters family owns them. You must get this to the federal authorities. Know that I love you more than words can say. Be strong. Be brave. Be the woman I always knew you were. Yours forever, Michael. The truth was a second gut punch. Michael hadn't just been a victim. He had been a fighter. He had been building a case against the men who killed him, right up until the very end. And he had known about Reed. He had chosen this place, this man, to be her sanctuary. Reed was reading the other letter, the one addressed to him. His face was pale. He knew, Reed said, his voice thick with disbelief. He knew everything. About Ellensburg. About me saving you. He says he found out while researching the Winters family. He never told you because he didn't want to resurface the trauma. It was all connected. A web of secrets and lies stretching back a decade, all converging on this tiny cabin in the middle of a snowstorm. So this is what Ezekiel is after, Eleanor said, touching the documents. It's not just me. It's this. This can destroy him, which makes you the most dangerous person in the world to him, Reed said grimly. He won't stop. He can't. A loud crack from outside made them both jump. It was a branch snapping under a heavy weight, too loud for any normal animal. Reed was at the window again, peering into the darkness. They're moving, he whispered, closing the circle. He turned back to the room, his eyes scanning their meager defenses. Then his gaze fell on the strongbox. There's more, he said, reaching back inside. His fingers closed around something hard and cold. He pulled it out. It was a pistol, a small silver-plated Derringer, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Tucked beside it were a handful of bullets. Michael wanted you to have this, Reed said, his voice low. He wanted you to be able to fight back. Eleanor took the gun. It was heavy, cold, and real. The weight of it was terrifying, but it was also empowering. She was not just a widow, not just a victim. She was Michael Sullivan's wife, and she was done being hunted. All right, Nathaniel Reed, she said, her voice clear and steady, the fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. You said this is where we make our stand. She looked at the pistol in her hand, then at the man standing before her. So tell me what to do. The night stretched on, an eternity of waiting. Reed moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency, barricading the single door with their heavy wooden table and reinforcing the window shutters. He showed Eleanor how to load and fire the small Derringer, his hands steady and patient as they guided hers. Aim for the center of the chest, he instructed, his voice a low whisper. Don't think, just point and shoot. It only has 2 shots. Make them count. He placed Sarah and a now chattering William in the safest corner of the cabin, behind the large stone hearth, piling their few blankets and bags around them as a makeshift barricade. I want you to stay here, no matter what you hear, he told them, his voice softer than Eleanor had ever heard it. You be brave for your brother, Sarah. And you, William, you're the man of the house until I get back. You protect your sister. William, his voice growing stronger with every word, looked Reed square in the eye. You're the man of the house, he said with the simple finality of a child. You protect Mama. A flicker of emotion crossed Reed's face before he masked it. He gave the boy a solemn nod. I will. He took up a position by the main window, his long rifle resting on the sill, a sentinel carved from shadow and resolve. Eleanor took the smaller window on the opposite wall, her Derringer clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The silence outside was absolute. The snow had stopped falling, and the moon cast an eerie, blue-white glow over the clearing. It was unnervingly beautiful. How many? She whispered across the room. Martha said 3, he answered, his eyes never leaving the tree line. But men like Ezekiel Winters don't travel light. Assume more. At least 5, maybe 6. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the children. Eleanor's muscles ached from the tension. Her mind raced, replaying the events that had led them here. Michael's death, the flight from Kansas, William's silent drawings, the impossible truth of the fire at Ellensburg. It felt like a lifetime crammed into a few short months. And then she saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. "Nathaniel," she breathed. "I see him," he whispered back. Another figure appeared, then a third. They moved with a practiced stealth, fanning out, using the trees for cover as they approached the cabin. In the moonlight, she could see the long barrels of their rifles. "They're professionals," Reed murmured. "Not just farm hands and thugs." A voice cut through the cold, crisp air. It was a voice she would never forget, the voice from her nightmares. Ezekiel Winters. "Eleanor," he called out, his tone mockingly cheerful. "My dear cousin, I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to my family. Let's not make this unpleasant. Send out the Pinkerton and hand over the box. Do that, and I'll let you and the children walk away." Eleanor's hands trembled. Walk away? To where? With what? He would hunt them to the ends of the earth. Reed's voice was a low growl beside her. "Don't listen to him. He's lying." "I'm not talking to you, Reed," Ezekiel shouted. "This is a family matter. Eleanor, you have 1 minute to decide. After that, my men have instructions to burn this cabin to the ground. It seems to be the only way to get your attention." The threat was a physical thing, a hand squeezing the air from her lungs. The smell of smoke, the memory of heat. It was all coming back. "He means it," she whispered to Reed. "I know," he said. His focus was absolute, his rifle steady. "Get ready." Ezekiel started counting down. 60 seconds, Eleanor. 59, 58. The world slowed down. Eleanor could hear the blood pounding in her ears. She looked over at the hearth where Sarah was holding a sleeping William, her small face a mask of terror. She looked at Reed, a silhouette of grim determination. He was willing to die here. For them. For a promise made to a dead man. "He thinks I'm still the scared little girl from Ellensburg," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly calm. She stood up from the window, walking to the center of the room. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Reed hissed. "Get down." She ignored him. Taking a deep breath, she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Ezekiel, I have the documents, but you're not getting them." There was a stunned silence from outside. "And I'm not your cousin," she continued, the words pouring out of her, a dam of fear and rage breaking. "I'm Eleanor Sullivan, and you murdered my husband." "Brave word," Ezekiel called back, his voice laced with venom. "Let's see how brave you are when the fire starts licking at your feet. 10 seconds. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said, her back to him. "Do you trust me?" "What?" "Trust me," she repeated. She walked to the fireplace and grabbed the heavy iron poker, its tip still glowing a dull red from the embers. 3, 2, 1. Just as Ezekiel screamed the final number, Eleanor did the last thing anyone expected. She swung the poker with all her might, smashing the glass of the main lantern. Oil sloshed out, igniting instantly. Flames erupted, catching on the dry wooden floor. "Eleanor!" Reed yelled, his face a mask of horror. "They want a fire, Ezekiel!" she screamed, her voice raw, triumphant. "Then let's give them a fire!" Flames shot up the walls of the cabin. Smoke began to fill the small space. Outside, Ezekiel and his men were frozen in shock. This wasn't part of their plan, but it was part of hers. The fire was a living, breathing monster. It roared, devouring the dry wood of the cabin with a terrifying hunger. Thick, black smoke clawed at their throats, making every breath a battle. "To the cellar!" Reed yelled over the inferno, grabbing the children. He knew what she was doing. He understood her desperate, insane gamble. Ezekiel and his men expected them to run out the door, into their waiting guns. They never expected this. Reed kicked open a trap door Eleanor hadn't even known was there, revealing a small dark hole leading to a root cellar. He bundled Sarah and William down into the darkness. "Stay there," he commanded. He turned back for Eleanor, his face grimed with soot, his eyes wild in the firelight. "You are the most stubborn, reckless, and incredible woman I have ever met," he shouted. "Is that a compliment?" she yelled back, her lungs burning. "I'll decide later. Come on." He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the trap door. But just as they reached it, a section of the roof collapsed, showering them with burning embers. A flaming beam crashed down, blocking their path to the cellar. They were trapped. Outside, Ezekiel's men were in chaos. The fire was spreading faster than they had anticipated, the heat driving them back. "They're still inside," one of the men yelled. "What do we do, boss?" Ezekiel stared at the blazing cabin, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had wanted to control the situation, to terrorize Eleanor into submission. He hadn't wanted this. A burned cabin meant the documents, his prize, would be turned to ash. "Circle the building," he screamed. "Shoot anything that moves. They have to come out sooner or later." Inside, the heat was unbearable. The smoke was so thick Eleanor couldn't see Reed, who was just a few feet away. She could only hear him coughing, choking. "The back wall," he gasped, his voice raw. "It's the weakest point." He began throwing his weight against the rough-hewn logs, trying to break through. Eleanor joined him, her shoulder slamming into the hot, splintered wood. It was useless. The wall was built to withstand a Montana winter. It wouldn't yield to them. "It's no good," she choked out, sinking to her knees, her vision starting to blur. This was it. After everything they had been through, they were going to die here, cooked alive in this tiny cabin, just a few feet above her children. She thought of Michael, of the promise she had made to him. She had failed. But then she heard it, a new sound over the roar of the fire, the thundering of hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming fast. "What is that?" she coughed. Reed was slumped against the wall, but he lifted his head. "I don't know." A woman's voice, powerful and clear, cut through the night. "Nathaniel Reed! Hold on!" Martha Blackwood. She wasn't alone. Riding beside her were at least a dozen men, their faces grim in the firelight. Some were settlers Eleanor recognized from the town. Others were Cherokee warriors, their presence a silent, deadly threat. Ezekiel and his men were caught completely by surprise. They turned from the burning cabin to face this new, unexpected army. "Who the hell are you?" Ezekiel demanded. Martha brought her pony to a halt, her expression like carved stone. "We are his neighbors," she said simply. The battle was short and brutal. Ezekiel's hired guns were professionals, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Martha's allies fought with the fury of people defending their own. Inside the cabin, the air was almost gone. Eleanor was fading, the world turning gray at the edges. She felt Reed's hand find hers in the suffocating darkness. "Eleanor," he rasped, "the documents in my coat." "Don't," she whispered. "Don't you dare say goodbye." The back wall of the cabin suddenly exploded inward in a shower of splinters and burning wood. A massive figure silhouetted against the fire stood in the opening. It was the barkeep from the saloon, wielding an axe. "Reed!" he yelled. "Get them out of there!" He and another man plunged into the inferno, grabbing Reed and Eleanor and dragging them out into the cold, clean air. Eleanor gasped, her lungs screaming as they filled with oxygen. She could see the fight was nearly over. Ezekiel's men were dead or captured, but Ezekiel himself was making a run for it. He'd gotten to his horse and was spurring it toward the dark safety of the forest. No, not after all this. He was not getting away. With a surge of adrenaline, Eleanor staggered to her feet. Reed's rifle was on the ground where he'd dropped it. She snatched it up. It was heavy, unfamiliar, but she remembered what he'd told her. Center of the chest. Don't think. She raised the rifle, the stock clumsy against her shoulder. She peered through the sights, finding Ezekiel's retreating back. He was almost to the tree line. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed her backward, but the shot was true. Ezekiel cried out, clutching his shoulder, and tumbled from his horse. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't going anywhere. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire and the groans of the wounded. Martha was at Eleanor's side in an instant. "The children," Eleanor gasped. Are safe, Martha assured her. We got them out of the cellar as soon as we arrived. Eleanor sagged with relief, the rifle slipping from her grasp. She looked at the smoldering ruins of the cabin, at the captured men, at the wounded form of Ezekiel Winters. It was over. It was finally, truly over. Then she looked at Reed, who was being tended to by the barkeep. He was burned, bruised, and coughing up smoke, but he was alive. His eyes found hers across the clearing, and in them she saw not just gratitude, not just respect, but something more, something new. It was the dawn, not just of a new day, but of a new life. The aftermath was a blur of hazy, surreal moments. Marshal Harker and his deputies arrived from Helena an hour later, summoned by a rider Martha had sent as soon as she'd seen the smoke. They took Ezekiel and his surviving men into custody, their faces sullen and defeated. They took the strong box of Michael's documents, the papers miraculously saved by Reed, who had shielded them with his own body in the fire. Justice, slow and hard-won, was finally set in motion. Eleanor didn't care about any of that. Her world had shrunk to the small circle of faces around her. Sarah, her journal miraculously intact, was already documenting the night's events with a reporter's intensity. William, his voice now confident and clear, was explaining to a wide-eyed settler how he had known Mr. Reed was a hero all along. And Reed himself, Nathaniel. He sat by the back of a wagon, his burns treated by Martha's skilled hands, watching Eleanor with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was a look of awe, of wonder, and of a deep, bone-weary relief. As the sun began to rise, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and orange, she walked over to him. "I burned down your house," she said, her voice small. He managed a weak, smoke-rasped chuckle. "It was just wood and nails," he said. "We can build another one." "We—" The word hung in the air between them, full of unspoken possibilities. He looked at her, at the soot on her face, the wildness in her eyes, the sheer, unyielding strength that had brought them all through the fire. "The shot you made," he said, "I've seen trained soldiers who couldn't do that." "You told me not to think," she replied with a shrug. "So I didn't." A comfortable silence fell between them. The promise they had made to each other, the future they had dared to imagine, felt more real now than ever before. It had been forged in fire, tested by blood, and it had survived. "What happens now?" she asked. He reached out, his bandaged hand gently taking hers. "Now," he said, his gray eyes looking directly into hers, a promise passing between them that needed no words. "Now we go home." Spring came to the valley, melting the snow and washing the world clean. A new cabin rose from the ashes of the old one, bigger and stronger, with a wide porch that faced the morning sun. It was built by many hands, by Reed, by the barkeep, by settlers and neighbors who had come to respect the quiet man and the fierce woman who had faced down the Winters gang. The trial in Denver was a formality. With Michael's documents and the testimony of a dozen witnesses, Ezekiel and Jacob Winters were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives in a federal prison. Their corrupt empire crumbled to dust. Life in the valley settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor's third child, a daughter with her mother's strength and her father's steady gray eyes, was born on a warm summer evening. They named her Faith. William became Reed's shadow, learning to track and hunt, his voice filling the cabin with questions and laughter. Sarah's journals grew thick with stories of the wilderness, of Martha's herbal lore, and of a family pieced back together from broken parts. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Eleanor sat on the porch, rocking Faith in her arms. Reed sat beside her, his arm resting comfortably around her shoulders. The children were chasing fireflies in the growing dusk. "He would have liked this," Eleanor said softly. "Michael, he would have loved this life for them." "He would be proud of you," Reed said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "You got his justice, Eleanor. You made it right." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her that she once thought was lost forever. They weren't a family born of tragedy anymore. They were just a family, whole, healed, home. The past was a part of their story, a chapter of fire and shadow, but it was not the whole book. The pages ahead were blank, waiting for them to write a new story together. This story is a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, the human spirit can burn brighter than any fire. It shows that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about facing it down for the people you love. If you were on the edge of your seat through Eleanor's journey and you believe in the power of justice and new beginnings, do us a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of survival and resilience. And in the comments below, let us know, what was the moment you knew Eleanor wasn't going to be a victim anymore? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay safe out there.